Testing microphone. Looks like it works. Okay. So let me do a quick review of what we talked about the last couple of days. Some of the things you should know, especially going into our quiz next week, would be like terminology. Like if I were to ask you to name something that is abiotic, would you be able to say that something abiotic would be, say, like air? Right? Because air is not living, right? Or water or sunlight. But if I were to ask you for something that is biotic, you might say a gerbil is biotic, or bacteria is biotic. It's living. Does that make sense? Right? Maybe I'd give you a list, and I'd say 4 of the things off the list are living and 4 are non-living. Like, that's something you should know, right? Or maybe you need to know the words communities versus populations versus species, right? You know the difference between those terminologies, right? Last day we talked. It's not so much the sex ed part of it, although like it's kind of like that. But like we need to talk a little bit about, well, like where did you come from and how do you exist, right? And we were all the product of a mom and a dad, and their either sperm and egg coming together, right? Does anyone remember the term for like what a either sperm or egg is? What the science word for that is called? Say it again. Yeah, gametes, right? And so 2 gametes come together. That's a word you should know. Gametes. 2 gametes come together. And through the process of sexual reproduction, they add their genetic material together. Okay? We have 46 chromosomes, but it's actually really 23 pairs. Why are they in pairs? Even this picture right here. Why do these things come in pairs? Why is there this set right here and this set right here? You can actually literally see the words on here, right? Half came from mom, half came from dad. Which really makes something unique because really you have doubled up DNA. You have genes, you have DNA that tells your body, hey, you should make an eye right here. But you actually have 2 copies of it. In a way, it would be weird. It would be like you go to the kitchen to try to make some bread, and there's 2 recipes there, right? Or you want to go bake cookies, and there's 2 recipes. How does the body know which recipe to follow? Because there's 2. Well, another set of terminology we talked about was dominant and recessive genes. And if there is a dominant recipe, it uses that one. If there's 2 dominant recipes, who cares? It's the same either way. If there's 2 recessive recipes, well, same thing, it doesn't really matter. Really, the idea is that if you have one that's different than the other, we pick one that dominates. Does that make sense? And that's what we're going to focus on today. One more thing. Someone asked me some questions about terminology. DNA would be like the whole strand of what you've got there, and part of that DNA, a little snippet of it, would be a gene. So if you can imagine like a, like I don't know, maybe I'll just even draw something out. Imagine that DNA kind of has this look to it. It's that like spirally kind of shape, where there's that like double helix where it goes, like this maybe. Not the world's greatest artist, but let's say this is your DNA, and in there were those like bands. Does that kind of make sense? This is your DNA here. Okay. Imagine I were to take a snippet of it. So if I were just to highlight from here to here, this could then be some genes. Now those genes could be for your eyes. I'll use eyes, it's a great example, right? Now, parts of the little things here for these genes about eyes, much of it's going to be the same as your neighbors, right? Because everyone here, I think, has round eyes, right? That would be something that the genes would have to tell your body to do. Make this in the shape that's round. All of us are going to have a large section of our eyes that has like a white color to it, right? But there's going to be a specific little part of it, just the littlest bit there, where maybe it's different. And the word we use for that is called an allele. I'll write that out again, allele. Okay? An allele is part of a gene. A gene is part of your DNA. DNA is part of like working your way up, okay? So the allele is one very, very specific thing, and it changes your traits, which would be like, do you have red eyes or blue eyes? Or known as red eyes. Do you have brown eyes or blue eyes? Does that make sense? So the allele, depending on which allele you have or whether you have a dominant one, can make the changes there. And that's what we're going to talk about today, okay? So when the zygote gets formed, where the 2 gametes come together and make a brand new species, right? There's always going to be those 2 copies. We're going to talk about how you inherit that a little bit more in detail. So I want to start off with this idea again. We did this, one of them in our notes last day, and that's going to be the main focus of not only today's lesson, but the activity we do with cards. Okay? Often what we do is we have like dad on one side and mom on another side, and there's kind of 4 boxes in the middle there. and it represents the possibilities that could exist. Okay. Let me walk you through this again. This is called a Punnett square, by the way. Okay. Dad has brown hair. You can kind of see that by the color here, right? But Dad actually has two genes in him. Why does Dad have two genes? Because he had two parents, right? That would be the grandparents, right? So Dad had two genes, one that's a capital R, and one that's a small r. I believe the way this picture works is this capital R, if it's capital R, it is going to be a dominant gene. Capital letters are always for dominance, and I bet you this one is for brown. Whereas a little r is known as the recessive gene. And let's go with that one as red today. This would actually work really well for me and my family, by the way. I have brown hair. But apparently, my hair works something like this. I have a capital R brown gene from either my mom or my dad. I don't know. And actually, I do know, because my dad's side had red hair in it. So it must be on my dad's side. So this must have been like my dad's dad. Whereas my dad's mom, or actually this one would have been the red side for me. Anyways, does that make sense though? One of these comes from like your grandma, one comes from your grandpa, right? And so the capital R for brown is dominant. There's two recipes, right? Your genes has two different sets of them, one from mom, one from dad, and one of them has to win if there's different. So the dominant one here, and so that's why dad has brown hair. But dad apparently could have had red hair. But brown wins out, right? Mom has the exact same thing. Mom has a brown hair dominant gene from, say, her dad, and from her mom, she got a redheaded gene, right? Which hair color shows out? Well, the brown one does. Now, the way this kind of works is it's kind of like a grid. It's a chart. It tells you the possibilities. For example, dad has to pass on a gene. We don't know necessarily which one it's going to be. So let's say hypothetically dad passes on this one right here, capital R. And let's say mom passes on capital R as well. Say they're both capital R's. Well, you know how I talked about the idea of there being two recipes? There's actually not two recipes. There's one recipe here. It is the brown-haired recipe here and here, so that person has brown hair. Right? Or in this corner right here, let's say you passed on the redhead gene and the redhead gene, which is what my daughter Cadence has. Right? Two brown-haired people could have a red-headed child. And in this case here, there's really no conflict. Both recipes are the exact same. This gene says have red hair. This gene says has red hair, so you have red hair. But it's these two right here where there's a conflict. And that's where dominance comes in, right? Where the idea is that, say, dad passed on the redhead gene, mom passes on the brown-haired gene. There's two recipes. You really have to choose, well, is it this one or this one? Okay. Now, a couple things can happen. Either it can be like kind of like a spectrum. Can you guys see how like the hair right here is a little bit darker than that one right there? That can happen sometimes too. Okay. Sometimes it's not like either or. Sometimes there's a bit of a range. But you can kind of see right here, this really still came out as brown because the brown one took priority. And the same thing kind of happened right here. Okay. My goal today, my biggest goal, is that you guys can kind of interpret these sorts of squares and kind of understand the idea as to how genes get passed on. So here I want to talk a bit about maybe not people, because people breeding is maybe a little less what we want. Like, let's talk dogs, because I think dogs, most people can kind of understand this concept. Okay. Anybody have dogs? Okay. Lots of people have dogs. I have two. I actually have a purebred and a hybrid. Let me talk to you about my two dogs. I have a purebred Yorkie. I don't know if you guys know much about dogs, but a Yorkie, small, little, bitty, yappy one, really cute, used to be really fluffy. And the Yorkie is a purebred because if I were to go back to its parents, its grandparents, as far back as we can probably know, the only types of genes that are in my Yorkie are just one type. Okay. But I also have a second dog. I have an Australian Labradoodle. And a Labradoodle is kind of a cool one because if you know kind of how the word works, Labradoodle, it is part Labrador and part poodle. I've never heard that before. Anyone have like a dog that's like a half and half, right? And so as you kind of go back in its ancestry, there's somewhere in there's the Australian Labrador got bred with a poodle, and that's the breed that kind of came from it. Now, once my Australian Labradoodle was bred, I think they tried to just keep it breeding with that. Sometimes we have a phrase for like the type of dog that just breeds with anything. You ever heard the phrase like a mutt? Where it's kind of a dog that like, it's got all sorts of different types in it, right? That's what I'm talking about here. The idea of a purebred or a hybrid. A purebred, very defined traits, very distinguishable. Right? The genes are very consistent from generation to generation. But if you have hybrids, well, then you get characteristics of both breeds. You guys are all hybrids. You have to be, right? Because the genetic material you get from mom and dad is different. which is why you look a little like your mom and probably a little like your dad. Does that make sense, right? You've got some traits. Maybe you look a little more like mom, and like they say, well, man, you look like your mom, but you have your dad's ears, right? Like phrases like that, right? That's what I'm kind of trying to talk about here. So I need you guys to know these words here: purebred versus hybrids. Okay. Here's kind of a picture again, talking about what I've been discussing here, the idea of dominance or recessives. Okay. When the two gametes come together, making the zygotes, this is really key. There are always two genes present. It seems weird. Two of them. One from mom, one from dad. The classic example would be gender. This is dad. This is mom. Dad would have an XY chromosome. The Y is dominant, therefore making your dad male. If you have two recessive X's, that makes it female. Right? You have two different genes that determine your gender. And then depending on how they get passed down depends on whether it's boy or girl. It's a 50-50 shot of you having a boy or a girl. Right? If this X and this X come together, that's a girl. If this X and that Y come together, it's a boy. If this X and this X to come together, it's a girl. This X and that Y come together, it's a boy. You guys can see that 2 times out of 4 you'd get a girl, 2 times out of 4 you get a boy, which is why it's like 50-50 shot at it. Right? That's what I talk about right here. The winner, though, determines on who happens to be the dominant one. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm repeating myself, so I'm going to move on here. Most of you guys seem to be nodding. Okay, so let's do an example. This is really the crux of what our point is today. I need you guys to be able to understand these sorts of diagrams and pictures and figure out where this comes from. We're actually going to work backwards here. This is an example of cats breeding. And just to let you know, I'm going to use 2 different letters. Okay? Often we use the same letter with a capital and a lowercase. I'm going to use 2 different ones to keep track. The way the cat works is that B is going to be black, and it's going to be dominant. And little w is going to be white, and white is recessive. So cats can either be black or white in this scenario. Okay. And what we've done is we've decided to breed a white mom cat with a black dad cat. And as we look at it, it actually appears that every single one of their cats came out black. Let's see if we can try to like write the little chart here that kind of explains why. So let's start with the easy one. Mom's genes. If mom is going to be white, what did she have to have as both of her genes? They both had to be W's. Does that make sense? Because let me try a possibility here. If they were not that, let's say it was a black and white for mom. What color would mom's coat have been? Well, it would have been black. The only way it would work, right? There's some possibilities. It could be black, black. Well, she'd have a black coat. It could be black, white. She'd still have a black coat. The only way it works for mom is if she was 2 white genes. That's the only way that this coat could be white, right? Well, the dad, there's really 2 possibilities here. The dad could have been black with black, or the dad could have been black with white. Because see how both of these would make the cat black because the dominant one takes over? But hang on a sec. If all 4 cats of their offspring came out as black, there's only one possibility. It would have had to have been the black possibility. Because watch how this would work. This black would go with that white, but that would give a black cat. This black would go with that white. Hang on, this is the same thing 4 times, that would give a white cat. Black with white, this would give a black cat in all scenarios. This must have been how this worked, if they're only ever producing black cats. This guy right here was a purebred. This guy right here was a purebred, and now they've created hybrids. Sorry, go ahead. Do you have a question? It's very possible, yeah. Like if these cats mated with other ones, they could. That's actually our next example. You're actually a little ahead of me, but let's do the next one then if everyone kind of followed that one. Where's my next slide? Here it is. Let's try this one here. Let's say that you had a black-catted mom and a black-catted father. It's actually possible that one of them could have a white kitten. Let's show why. The way this would have to work then is there's 2 possibilities. Either this was black-black or black. Because it couldn't be white-white, right? If it was. And this cat right here, or black with a hidden gene behind there. the way this must have worked is it must have been black, white, and black, white. Hey, good, Marco, right? Okay, for sure. I'll catch up with you later. Okay. So this is the way it must have worked here. Let's kind of work through the logic behind it. If this gene and this gene went together, it would have produced a black cat. I mean, doubly in that way, right? Because both were black. In this case right here, it would have been black with white, and this would have held the gene in behind, but it would have presented as a black cat. This would also have been black and white, but look at the last possibility. 1 out of every 4 cats, both recessive genes would get passed on. And look, you'd get a white cat out of it. You guys visualize how that works there? Okay. Again, if this doesn't make sense, don't worry. That's why we're going to do an activity with like playing cards on Wednesday. But this is what I kind of need you guys to be able to do. I'm actually going to show you an old PAT question in a bit. Let's do 2 more examples and we get to that PAT question. This kind of goes the other way. This one's already filled out, right? What's happened here is a purebred recessive has mixed with a hybrid right here. And really, there's a 50-50 shot of this happening. In 2 of the cases, the dominant gene takes over. Or in 2 of the cases, the recessive gene takes over. And here's one more picture. This is about brown versus blue eyes. And again, you guys can kind of look through these a little bit if you'd like. But I feel like I've kind of explained the concept. So why don't we try a practice question? Because you guys are going to get this on your PAT at some point. So here's a diploma question, or PAT question. So if you have it in front of you, find this one. If not, I'll read it for the whole group here. So here's the scenario. A man and a woman who both have brown hair have 3 children. 2 of the children have brown hair, but 1 has blonde hair. Let's read that one more time. 2 people have brown hair, but their kids, well, most of them have brown hair, but one of them came out blonde. They're going to give us some codes here. They're going to go with brown dominant being capital B, and blonde, which must be recessive, is little b. So the question is, what possibility of genes made this work? Let's walk through them one at a time. If it was little b, little b, little b, little b, this would have been mom and dad. Well, this would have been mom being blonde and dad being blonde. Doesn't that directly contradict the fact that it said that mom and dad were brown-haired? So right off the bat, this is off because this means that mom and dad were both blonde. So it's got to be one of the last 3. Now, why don't I just try a quick square for, say, like I'm going to do D just to show you how it can't be D. If you tried doing D and you went capital B, capital B, capital B, capital B, wouldn't it just be capitals everywhere through? Well, no one's going to be blonde that way, so it definitely can't be this one either. You better have at least some blonde genes in the family. Okay. The question is, do you need to have a purebred and a hybrid? Or do you need to have... Try C next. Let's try capital B, capital B, capital B, little b. Well, this would give me BB. Okay, that would be a brown-haired kid. Fair enough. This right here would be BB, brown-haired kid. BB here. And that's still a brown-haired kid, isn't it? And right here, still a brown-haired kid. There's no possible way for you to have a blonde in this scenario, so that one's out. Must be B. Let's just prove it. If you had big B, little b, big B, little b. Okay, right here, definitely brown-haired kid. Here, yep, brown hair. Here, brown hair. Ah, here's the one we're looking for. Little b with little b. If 2 recessive traits happen to come together, then this kid could be blonde. So the right answer is B. Did that make sense? Cool, I'm glad. Because that's really the main focal point of our lesson. If you guys can follow and understand that, that's most of what we're going for today. Cool. Okay, now, one of the things I got to point out, though, is that it's not always black and white. Like, when I do those charts there, it's kind of like it's either or. And the problem with that is, well, what do you do if you have, like, hair that's kind of half blonde, half brown, or what happens if, like, your eye color isn't brown or blue, but you have, like, a green color? Like my wife, her eyes are kind of like a greeny, gray blue. Like, I can't even figure out what color it is. You know, they ask me, what color are your wife's eyes? And I have to admit, like, I don't actually know. And they say, you don't know what color your wife's eyes are? And I'm like, I don't know what color to call it. Like, it's not blue, it's not brown, it's kind of in between. And that happens too. Right? Here's a really good example of that. Dominant recessive patterns are typical, but there's somewhere it's mixed. If you guys can have this in color by any chance, can you guys see how there's some red flowers right over here? There's some white flowers over here. This is called a snapdragon. And the way it works is that if red mates with red, perfect, they stay red. If white, well, I shouldn't say mates. We should use the word for flowers. It would be pollinate, right? If white pollinates with white, it stays white. But what if this red and this white over here pollinate with each other? That's where the pink comes from, which kind of makes sense because wouldn't you expect kind of like the in-betweenness there? So we have a name for this. Go ahead. I wonder whether that could be the yellow and the red, perhaps. Yeah, yeah. I didn't intend for that on this picture, but I bet you're right. Yeah. So here's the word we use for that. It's called incomplete dominance. Okay. Not everything is entirely black and white, where it's like A or B. Right? Sometimes there's a bit of a spectrum, and things can mix in that sort of way, and that's fine too. It would almost be like, remember I gave the recipe analogy where you're making cookies, and you have to choose. Either you're making ginger snaps, or you're making chocolate chip. But in incomplete dominance, really the analogy would be that you decide to use half the recipe for ginger snaps, you decide to use half the recipe for chocolate chip, and you have ginger chips. Right? You've made like a new mix of them. In the exact same way, you can use this in your mind, where like my labradoodle is like kind of parts of each. Does that make sense? Like there can be kind of a spectrum there. Right? It's not where you pick one or the other, you're actually mixing them together. So that's incomplete dominance. I need you guys to know that term. I almost guarantee there's going to be a PAT question on that. So, now, I want to go back a bit to the concept of variation, because that's a big theme in our unit. Variation is really important, because it means that not everything looks the exact same as each other, right? I mean, I even used you guys as an example in here. We've got all sorts of different variations, from hair color to skin color to eye color to, I mean, even little things like whether you have a little cleft in your chin or how your earlobes work, right? We want variation. Now, maybe we don't care about it so much in humans, because I think humans are kind of the top of the food chain, but like in species like, say, these tigers that I've got right here, there's a little bit of subtle changes between them, and that's important because if it wasn't for that, they would look exactly like each other, and there would be no differences. And that could be bad. And it's this paragraph, this little like short blurb right here that's really important. I rarely read right off my notes. You guys might have noticed. I don't just stand at the front of the room and just read what's written there, but this one I'm going to. Variation is important for when environments change because it gives the species a chance to adapt and survive. Let me read that again. Variation is important. Why? When environments change, because it gives the species a chance to adapt and survive. I'm going to come back to the slide. I want to show you this picture. I think this illustrates it all. Here are two rabbits. In the same way that we've just been doing this thing where you could have cats that are black that have a white offspring, or white cats that have black offspring. These bunnies right here, these rabbits, can either be brown or white. Why was that variation so important? Well, what does change for their habitat? Well, if they live north, it could either be like snow, or it could be like summertime. How is that going to affect them? How is this bunny right here at a major disadvantage right now? Take it away. Yeah, and what does that mean for interactions? This is another thing we talked about, right? Different types of interactions. Predator-prey interactions. This bunny is someone's food on the food chain. I don't know exactly who, a fox, let's say, right? Well, the white one can hide in the wintertime, and this guy can't, right? But the environment's going to change. What's going to happen in the summertime? In the summertime, who's going to be at the disadvantage? This guy here. Does that make sense? And by having variety in our species, by having variation, it means that the bunny habitats, the rabbits, can survive. Because let's say that in the wintertime, all of the brown ones die, and the white ones live. Now, bunnies don't take very long to reproduce, right? So a whole bunch of brown ones die in the wintertime. Fortunately, these guys lived. Well, they reproduced, had a whole new set of little bunny rabbits, right? And in the springtime, when all of a sudden it's now, there's dirt out on the ground, well, now these guys can survive, but these guys might die. Right? Now, I'm not saying all of them will, but wouldn't it make sense, though, that if you only ever had brown bunnies and it was always snowing nearby, I don't like their chances. Does that make sense? Which is why we call that adaptation. It's not necessarily that like the bunny intentionally just is like, flick, I'm all of a sudden going to change my coat, right? It's not like they're mutants and it's like the X-Men here where they can change the way they look, but slowly over generations, certain traits are more like useful. That's what I want to go back here. I'll read this bit here. What if there's a new predator? What if there's a disease, a toxic substance? What if food sources go away? This is the key here. If there's only ever one trait available, that's when things could go extinct. Could go extinct. Does that make sense? So it's actually a good thing we have variation. Right? I think I gave a silly example the other day, but imagine that a new disease came along where people with blue eyes all of a sudden got that disease. Well, if everybody here had blue eyes, the human race would probably go extinct at some point because we'd all catch that disease. Right? But if some of us have brown eyes and some have blue eyes, I know it sucks to have blue eyes. I have blue eyes, that's why I picked that one, right? People with blue eyes, we have a bit of a disadvantage, right? But people with brown eyes would live. Right? And it's possible that me with my blue eyes, I might end up having a child with brown eyes maybe, right? Actually, that's not how that one would work. We'd have to flip that, right? But we have that possibility of there being an offspring that would have brown eyes, and maybe they would survive, right? So maybe I wouldn't, but maybe my kids could. Right? This has actually been coined a term. I need you guys to know this. It's known as natural selection. It was Darwin who actually, you guys heard of Darwin? Yeah. Darwin and his finches, that's where he kind of coined this term. Maybe actually I'll tell the story. The way Darwin kind of came across this concept is he was studying birds. They're called finches on an island. And he discovered that birds had different types of beaks. Some of them were like really narrow, thin ones, almost like tweezers. Other ones were like big and bulky. And he discovered that each of their beaks kind of did different things, and they lived in different spots. The beaks that were like big and bulky, they could crack open nuts to get food. Whereas like the beaks that were pointy and thin, they could like reach inside of logs and like pick a worm out of there, right? And so they each had like slightly different beaks, and that was kind of useful because thank goodness there was a bunch of variety, otherwise maybe the whole thing could die off. So the phrasing you might hear then is called survival of the fittest. Basically the idea is that there are heritable characteristics. That makes sense, doesn't it? Like it's something that you inherit, a characteristic, and it gets passed on from generation to generation. This is a newspaper article or I pulled offline that actually I find fascinating because my wife works in this field. I told you guys my wife works in the childbirth, labor, and delivery section, right? So it's her job to make sure babies come out healthy. One of the most amazing things I find talking to my wife is that there are some births that go well, right? No complications, mom's in and out, and they're safe. But there are a lot of births where something goes wrong. Baby's heart rate rises, something ruptures, baby doesn't come out properly, right? And it's actually, that's why they need the doctors and nurses, right? If you know what a C-section is, it's where they literally have to like cut the mom's abdomen open, cut through the muscle, and literally like take the baby out, as opposed to the natural way of giving birth, which is through the pelvis. And anyways, the point I wanted to describe here is that I've talked with Melissa about this. There's evidence actually that because of the fact that humans have figured out how to save babies, it's actually changing our human evolution a little bit. Okay, think back 100, 150 years ago where we didn't have the ability to do surgeries to save moms and babies who were going to not survive. Sometimes babies just didn't kind of fit through the pelvis on the way out of a woman, and moms would die giving birth. That was actually really common for moms to die. And one of the reasons why is that if you were like, say, really narrow in the hips, literally baby couldn't fit, it gets stuck, and there you go. Does that make sense? But because of C-sections, now if a baby doesn't have the ability to like naturally go through the pelvis, narrow pelvis women are able to pass on their genes to their daughters because their daughters are surviving due to C-sections. You get what I'm saying here? And what it's meaning is that in the past, through natural selection, if you had narrow hips, you would die. Sorry, right? But now if you have narrow hips, you can live. And you pass on your narrow hips to your daughter, who passes on her narrow hips to her daughter. And what ends up happening is the need for C-sections is increasing because of the fact that new genetic material is being passed on that normally, unfortunately, just would have died. Does that make sense? Now, I'm not saying this is a bad thing by any means. It's interesting. But that seems to be the way things are working. And so C-sections are actually becoming more and more common as people who used to would have died can now live, which is fantastic, right? But it's fascinating, isn't it? So I use that as my example of survival of the fittest. Right? Certain traits are just better for living, whether that's a tiger looking for food, a bunny trying to not be eaten, or humans trying not to die in childbirth. So. Well, here's some more terminology we need to know. When we talk about these inherited characteristics, really there's two types. I've already kind of described them. There's either the discrete ones, where it's like this or this. You either have blue eyes or you have brown eyes. There's some traits that are like that. That's actually not a good example. Because other ones are continuous, where you kind of have that range. Okay. I think this one's a good example. These are actually traits that you can have in peas, pea plants. Okay. And some of these are going to be discrete. Like, for example, either it's round or it's wrinkled. That's one or the other. That would be a good example of discrete. But I think the color would be a little bit different. Color would be continuous because it could be green, it could be light green, it could be greeny yellow, it could be yellow with a little tinge of green, or it could be like full yellow. You get what I'm saying there? So those are the two words I need you to know. Discrete is like one or the other, like no middle ground. That's discrete. Continuous is where you have like, well, could be kind of in between. I think this one right here would be discrete again. Either it's white or it has some color to it. It could have a little bit of color, a lot of color, right? But either it's one or the other, right? What about short and tall? Is short and tall discrete or continuous? Let's do a quick vote here. Take a second to think about it. Is short and tall discrete or continuous? Think about that, and then I'll ask you to put your hands. Who thinks that short and tall is like one or the other? You're either short or you're tall. Oh, you guys thought about this here a little bit. Most of you think it's now continuous, right? Because, well, what if you're in the middle, right? What if you're kind of just average height, right? So this would be a good example of something that's continuous, right? And so there are different traits that are like that. Let me give you a good example of one on humans. Dimples is a good one. Dimples is discrete. Does anybody here have dimples? Okay. Well, if you didn't put up your hand, then you don't, right? Like you either have a dimple in your cheek or something like that, right? And you know what I'm talking about for that? Either you have one or you don't. You can't really have like half a dimple. Does that make sense? Right? So it's one or the other. This is my last slide, right? This slide here just going to kind of summarize things and talks about how the fact that like we get our genetic traits from our parents, but there are other factors we need to consider, and an environment needs to be considered as well. Okay. For this one here, the best example I can think of is weight, but I don't ever want to try to shame a person, so I'm going to use dogs as a good example here if you don't mind. Okay. My dogs, their weight is controlled by their genes. Like my little bitty Yorkie is never going to be 70 pounds. It never will be, because its genetic like makeup is not going to let it be that big. But that being said, if I overfeed my dog, it could get fatter. Does that make sense? And I found this slide right here on the internet where like here's some different stages of dogs where like here it's way too thin, here it's getting better, this is where it should be. This guy right here, he's kind of getting obese, he's getting way too many table scraps. Right? Because like weight and diet and exercise would have something to play. Does that make sense? So although there is some genetic backing to people who are just naturally heavier than other people, you know, there is also the environment as well, right? There are other things to be considered. Okay. And then there's actually one more thing we should discuss is that there's actually possibilities that there could be changes, mutations to genes. This right here isn't really a mutation, but I want to use that as an example. You can actually have mutations on genes through environments as well, like cancer, or like this one right here, alcohol. Okay. Hopefully you guys have heard this at some point before. It is not safe for pregnant mothers to drink during pregnancy. It actually causes birth defects. FAS, fetal alcohol syndrome, is a good example of this, where you don't get fetal alcohol syndrome from your mom based on genetics, but it does happen due to environmental concerns. Does that make sense? So there are some things, there are some diseases that are passed down genetically. There are other ones that are passed down, but it's based on this. That's why I'm underlining this, the environment as well. Guys, we have finished well more than half of our first unit. Isn't that awesome? So now we have a few minutes left here. Tomorrow's going to be some work time. Can I give you guys some suggestions on what to do now that I've kind of given you guys that knowledge section? Okay. So bear with me. I'm going to keep the recording going here. On my website, here's what I recommend we spend some time doing tomorrow. One, if you want to, you could rewatch me teach. I am so sorry, by the way. Did I point out that the first video had no audio? Sorry, that one's kind of useless. But let's say that you weren't here for part of that first lesson and you want me to talk it through. I can do that tomorrow. Okay? Or you could watch the genetics video. What you guys really need to do, though, is get some practice. And so we're going to do an activity on diversity, and we're also going to do an assignment. Those are kind of your first two things to like do that are application. So your assignment is not due till the end of the unit, by the way. I'm going to eventually, on this board over here, write down when some due dates are, but like it's not anytime soon, so don't freak out. But stay with me, okay? I really would recommend, even right now, or even in Flex, like, unless you guys have somewhere that you need to be in Flex, maybe just spend one Flex time, just kind of working on some of this stuff and making sure that you're up to date. Ask me for help, by the way. Like, don't feel like you need to know all these answers by yourself, but let's walk through a few of them. You guys should be able to do almost all of the questions in the assignment. Let me just pick one here, right? Like number 12. After me having taught you some stuff, do you feel like you know the difference between, let me zoom in here actually. Can you even see that? Do you know the difference between a gamete, a zygote, and an embryo? If you don't, that's fine. Here's a couple suggestions. Go back through our notes. They're in there. Let's say that doesn't work for you. You could go back and rewatch my video. Or you could just put up your hand and say, hey, Chris, can you walk me through this again? You know, what are the differences? Right? I'll even do it right now. It's kind of walking our way through there. A gamete is half, right? It's either the mom cell, the egg, or the dad cell, the sperm, or whatever animal we're talking about, right? It could be plants too, right? A gamete is half the genetic material. A zygote is literally when that material comes together for the very, very first time and creates, I mean, we call it a zygote, but for lack of a better purpose, you know, the first cell of a baby. And then once that zygote then undergoes some processes to duplicate itself, you guys remember talking briefly a bit about meiosis and mitosis? Right? When it goes through those processes, it eventually becomes an embryo. Right? There's a question. Right? Or we just talked about this one today. What is natural selection? Or another thing we talked about today. Can you tell me what a gene is versus an allele versus a trait? Right? And if you're struggling with this, please do not hesitate to ask me for help. Like, I've said this to you guys probably before. The reason why I have a job is because you don't know this stuff yet, right? So ask, let me look it over. Okay. So can I say this? Guys, we have 10 minutes left. I noticed a lot of you packed up. What I really want to encourage in you guys as learners is, I've done the knowledge section right now, but we got 10 minutes. Just try a little bit right now and see whether you get it. Don't wait for 2 days or 5 days. Like, do it now, right? Well, what else are you missing out on? You got to sit here twiddling your thumbs till the bell. Right? Does that make sense? So try a few of these questions. In theory, you should be able to get down to like number 17 or 18, like a fair way through this assignment. Okay. So I'll pack up now. You guys, I'll let you have the choice. If you wanted to sit there and do nothing, that's your call. Okay. But that's what I'd recommend. And tomorrow, that's what we're going to do as well. I'm going to give you time to practice. Okay. So yeah, you can work on it tomorrow too. I'm just saying, why don't you do a little bit right now while you're at it, right? You know, it won't take long. Or I mean, you can do a little bit, right? In terms of doing your work, by the way, can you write it on like loose leaf paper, I guess? I don't need you to rewrite out the question by any means, because you could literally have it on your phone. But like, you know, write it out nicely. You will be marking this, by the way. So make sure you can read your own writing. Okay, that's all I got. So you guys can do whatever you feel is best until the bell goes. Thanks, guys.